Going to call the meeting to order. Thank you. The TNRD acknowledges that we connect with many First Nation communities across our vast regional district, and today are located on the Thompson-Nicola territory, situated within the unceded ancestral lands of the Secwepemc Nation. The TNRD appreciates the partnership that we have with the Secwepemc and respects the territory and land on which we gather today. Okay, any additions to the agenda or deletions? I'm going to add a point. Manager Campbell, should I just do it in new business? Okay, then I'll just bring it up on new business. Motion to approve the agenda.
So moved.
Moved by Director Stamers, seconded by Director Morris. Any opposed? Carried. Thank you. Oh, we're on to the minutes. Any issues with the minutes from anyone? Motion to approve the minutes. Okay, I'll move the minutes. So moved. Moved by Director Smith, seconded by Director Laird. Any opposed? Thank you, carried. We're now at 5.1, Search Rescue Committee. Who's doing this? Are you? Whoever's up, you're up.
Thanks, Chair. I don't have a presentation on this. It's a fairly straightforward housekeeping policy amendment that we're suggesting. The main change is that the old policy referred to a committee that no longer exists, that we dissolved during the 2022 committee review. That's the most significant change in that policy.
Cool. Okay, any questions? Motion to approve. Moved by Director Laird, seconded by Director Thorpe. Any opposed? Carried. Thank you. 5.2, Privacy and Confidentiality Policy Amendment. Who's up?
Chair Bass, I'll turn it over to Deputy Corporate Officer Ms. Satt in a moment, but the purpose of this really is just to bring an amended privacy policy as a result of new legislative requirements for the TNRD and all local governments to have a privacy management program, and just to ensure that we're in compliance with recent changes under the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act. And if Ms. Satt wants to provide any other comments on the policy.
Thank you. Our corporate officer has pretty much covered the intent of what this report is. Within the report, we've identified the major changes and any additions to the policy.
Discussion? Director Middleton?
I'm thinking through reading this, that this is somewhat within, the systems and whatnot, and ensuring that there's not possibility of breaches. Does any sort of disclosures related to privacy, say on outgoing emails of all TNRD directors? We just ran into this in the city here where our disclaimer was maybe not quite what we wanted, and we've redone it. Do we require at TNRD to have disclaimers on emails and whatnot on privacy or confidentiality? Should something get sent to the wrong place, or should someone choose to, forward on an email that they shouldn't?
Yeah, through the chair, we do have disclaimers on our emails as part of this process. It's something that we should probably take a look at to make sure that it is the best language, that we're using the best language that we can. Yeah. I don't think there's anything specific about FOIs on there, but there is, perhaps the corporate officer can help me out here. There is a disclaimer that states that this email is confidential, it's standard language, and that if you receive it, please destroy it, do not pass it on.
I turned it off. Yeah, so we now have a disclaimer on our emails that's gone right through down to city. So I don't know whether it includes like the director's emails and stuff like that at TNRD to have those disclaimers on emails, because directors are potentially sending out emails, generating email from their own devices and whatnot, sending them out independent of anything that's coming from, you know, the board level, shall we say, or administrative levels. It's just a thought that should that be considered?
Absolutely, yeah, we'll make note of that.
Director Roden?
Thank you. I'm going to uphold my reputation of being that person and note that in item 2.2, collection of personal information, it reads consent much be provided. It should, of course, be must be provided.
We'll note that. Thank you.
This is why I love you, because when I was reading one of the reports, it was referring to people as that's. You know, and I thought, do I raise this? No, because you're nitpicking, Dale. Barbara will raise it instead. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Just one question, 2.4 says the TNRD must not over collect. I'm curious what over collect would look like.
What does over collect mean?
I think over collect would mean that we would only collect the information that's required for us to carry out our programs, what's necessary to carry out our programs. So for the library, it might be their name and their address and their contact information. We wouldn't collect anything more than that.
Okay, Director Morris? Any other questions from you? No? Questions from anyone else? Someone may want to move the recommendation then? Moved by Director Roden, seconded by Director Smith. Any more discussion? Any opposed? Carried. Thank you. 5.3, privacy breach investigation policy.
Turn that over again to Ms. Satt.
Much of the same information is repeated in this report that was in the previous report. We're doing this to maintain compliance with recent directives from the ministry and with changes to the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act. If there are any, I mean, it's there for you. If there are any questions, I'd be glad to take them.
If I could just add to that, so the distinction here is this lays out the actual process should there be a breach and what our obligations are should there be a privacy breach.
Questions from anyone? I have one sort of unrelated, but still related, and I'm curious. Have the number of FOIs we receive dropped since the audit?
Yes.
Good, thank you. Any other discussion? Somebody want to move the recommendation? Moved by Director Stimmer, seconded by Director Middleton. Any opposed? Carried. And we're now on to the Community Building Fund, and I believe CAO Hildebrand wants to speak.
Thank you, Chair Best. I just wanted to open this up with a quick, a few quick comments. I know that we've got 3 electoral area directors in this committee, which were taking part in a process. And I think I communicated this to the board a while back as we were kind of undertaking this whole review of the gas tax program. And the whole point was we were going to meet with the electoral areas directors first, and we did. We had a very good, robust discussion. We walked through all sorts of scenarios. We shared some of our concerns, some of the issues that we've had. We even shared, we even went into a closed meeting to talk a little bit deeper on some of the concerns that we had. So that conversation was very positive. We went through and answered a lot of those questions. The next step was to come to the policy committee now. And that's what we have in front of you. And I know that from the feedback I've heard from Director Laird and a few others electoral area directors, they feel like there's still a few things that we hopefully need to change here today with the board's direction. But we think we've come up, we're probably 90% or 95% of the way there. And I think we're in a much better, more effective, more efficient policy that'll kind of meet the expectations of the organization and make sure we're doing things right. So just with those comments, I'd pass it back to you for any questions.
Questions, discussion, anything? Director Middleton, then Director Laird.
Just on this one, and just as I was reading through, when we just look at the third party contractors that may be hired and how there's a reporting component back that's required from them to receive full payment, and I would question or wonder if the 5% holdback at the end is enough to get the information that's required. On a smaller contract, if you're sitting there holding back, you know, $1,000 from somebody, they might just say it's not worth their time to do that, and they'll just walk away, and then do we become sort of non-compliant with no means to sort of arm twist the information?
Through the chair, I believe that that's a good question. And I think we've done a great job of ensuring we kind of cover all the angles and making sure the application process is very fulsome. It covers everything is what we think. We're maybe not perfect yet, but Ms. Satt, would you have any feedback on the why the 5% holdback? I think that was just something that is an experience that we've had when we're applying for grants as an organization, and there's always a small holdback to complete, but just maybe some more thoughts from our deputy corporate officer.
Thank you, through the chair, and perhaps our CFO can help us out here. I don't know if that's standard practice. We do holdbacks on larger contracts. We came up with the 5% because we're dealing with a lot of nonprofits, and they rely on the money that they get. So we felt that 5% was probably enough to encourage them to provide the information. And it wouldn't harm them to hold back 5%. So in other words, they don't have a lot of reserves when they apply for this funding to be able to say, yeah, we're going to pay out of pocket. So it was done in consideration of what their financial situation might be. We felt at the time that 5%, given that we're dealing with third parties, was probably sufficient, but we can certainly change that.
Manager Campbell.
Through the chair, and so I've been away for a few weeks and I wasn't involved in this last iteration of this draft. So I just want to make sure that I think what this section is really saying is the remaining 25%, which is being held back, will be approved and forwarded upon receipt of the final report. But in the event, and so this would sort of be a sort of separate caveat, in the event that data collection is required to meet the measurable reporting outcomes, a 5% holdback would apply. But that 5% holdback is would only happen if there was this requirement for data collection.
That's correct.
Yeah.
So,
So really it's a 25% kind of holdback.
well, the 25%, so once we receive all of the invoices, we would pay 50% up front. We get interim reporting, we'll pay another 25%. If the interim reporting is sufficient, then we'll receive final reporting. If that final reporting doesn't involve any data collection, our corporate officer is correct, we would refund just to the maximum of what they paid out. If data collection is required, and I'm thinking in the instances where we've got energy efficiency improvements, and that's where we've run into most of our problems, is to prove that energy efficiency success, we need information from 1 year before the project started to 1 year after, so we can make that comparison to ensure that we've reduced the GHG emissions. So in that case, we would hold back the 5% until we have all of that data.
Director Stamer.
Thanks, Madam Chair. And further to that, just looking at the payment of funds and also the previous, this would be page 6 of 7. Talking about the third-party projects will only be funded to a maximum of 90%. And that the third parties would be responsible for overruns. What happens if they can't complete a project? So further to the 5%, what happens if it's only 50% completed or 60% completed and we've used all available funds? What mechanisms do we have to make sure that that project is complete?
So through the chair, what has typically happened in the past is that these requests would come back to the board. Through the application process, we are requesting that they build in contingencies. We're also advising them that they have to provide confirmation that they can meet cost overruns. How exactly that's going to look is going to depend on the project. I mean, if the request is just for a furnace replacement, it's going to be quite small. If the request is larger, first of all, these groups are going to have that 10% in place, and they're going to have to confirm that they do have additional funds for cost overruns. If they get to the point where funding that they have in the bank is not sufficient for cost overruns, I mean, at that point, we're kind of stuck. This is the risk with funding third parties. It would probably have to come back to the board. Because if we report to the federal government that this project is not complete, that we haven't met the measurables of the funding category, then we're required to pay back those funds. So that's part of the program that's the part of the program. And the reason that we came back to the board is we run that risk. It is a risk to enter into these agreements. Some of these programs have been really helpful to these smaller communities, but that's the risk to the organization as a whole.
I saw another hand somewhere. Was it you? Director Laird.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I've been involved in some significant amount of funds going into our community. I read through the new application form, and it's a good form, because if the proponent or the third party group that's looking for support, if they can't fill out all the information and meet the criteria that's necessary, it's a problem to start with. And what's been happening previous to this is that the funds have been allocated for instance, a new roof, and they find out there's a whole bunch of other things that have to be done before the roof goes on. If you follow this new application, that shouldn't happen. You have to have the proper contractors, and they have to have the proper engineer report or whatever that's required. So it's a good, I think it's a good new policy, and I think it'll work quite well. I am concerned a little bit about cost overruns. I'm not sure exactly how we will deal with it, because it happens even on TNRD projects. We have cost overruns on the TNRD projects, whether it's a eco depot or anything like that, and we deal with it somehow. We come back and get the funds sorted out. So I would imagine it might be something similar to that. You actually put a budget in with all your contingencies and everything, and it doesn't quite meet the enough funds. And as Agnes says, if we don't complete the project, then we have to repay it. So that hopefully won't happen, but I would imagine it will happen eventually. So just a thought on what happens when we are short of funds.
Director Roden.
Thank you. I share the concern about cost overruns. In Ashcroft. We saw our fire hall renovations and upgrades nearly double in cost between putting in the grant proposal and getting the grant and then being able to find someone to go ahead and do it. I think a good step towards avoiding some of that is making this much more business-like than it has been in the past, which I think this goes a long way towards doing. A couple of things came out of the EA directors meeting where this was discussed, which I sat in on. All projects, well, this wasn't, but all projects must be approved by 30th of September, the year before the project is to take place. What happens if a group identifies the need for something in November and they want to do it the following spring? Are they hooped basically, and they're told they have to wait a year?
CFO Fox.
Thank you, Chair Bass, through to directors and Director Roden. The requirement for September is to try and support and follow the current process we have to follow with all our projects, to have them included on the budget for approval. There is a couple ways we can do this based on the board's desire. So we could have an amount in the budget unidentified or unattached to specific projects. That is just open gas tax projects that has some revenue and some expenditures in there to cover some miscellaneous projects. Our preference is to have as much as possible projects approved a year in advance. One, it follows the legislation, having the board have that approved, and it's pre-planned. The pre-planning really allows us to do a thorough and responsible job from administrative side to make sure that all the due diligence has been put in, as with our other projects, to ensure the risk and all of the parameters have been taken into account. But if there is a desire from the board to want to address ones that come up in the year so that you can approve through the year, we would have to add a piece in there that allocated a bit into the budget. Let's just say, for example, you have $500,000 worth of gas tax revenue covering $500,000 of miscellaneous projects. And it allows you that ability to manage within that amount. If all of a sudden you're allocating and it's over $500,000 and it's $600,000, we would actually, following legislation, we should be doing board approval for a budget amendment. Budget amendment takes probably about a month from pulling the report together, redoing the 5-year financial plan, ensuring those numbers are captured in there. So right now, any project that wouldn't be approved under how we've brought this forward would end up having to be a budget amendment if you approved it after the budget's been approved.
CEO Hildebrand and then Director Thorpe.
Thank you, Chair, and to Director Roden. I think we've done a very vigorous job of making sure that the vetting of these organizations are top priority and being more businesslike, as you mentioned. And this would be what we're expected to do as an organization when we're looking for grants, the province or federally or something. We have to go through all these hoops as well. So to say that third parties are more risky, they are. So we're trying to get them to that standard as close as we can in order to make sure that they're viable. So we will certainly work with them. And if we need to do an amendment, we can do an amendment because there's going to be exceptions for sure, but it'll come to the board for approval.
Director Thorpe.
Is there a way, back to this, if we have a budget overrun, is there a way that the board can remove themselves from being responsible? Can we somehow put the onus back on the third party, that if we can't complete this, that somehow they're the ones that are going to have to pay back and not the board?
So through the chair, you know what, that's a good question. It depends on the nature of the third party. Quite often these groups, they're not for profits. They don't have the ability. We can put it in the contract to say you're responsible for cost overruns, you're responsible for repayment. But in reality, the question is, do they have the ability to repay? Ultimately, we're responsible for the gas tax funds. The organization is responsible for making sure that it's spent on eligible projects, that it's a successful project, and that we report on the required measurables. And if we don't, ultimately that responsibility is ours to repay those funds if the project doesn't succeed.
Supplemental, and then Director Steamer and then Director Roden.
Is there a way then to know if there's going to be a cost overrun before we get too far into that project? And say, okay, we're at say when we hit that 50% mark, and we could say, okay, halt, stop. This is going to get just crazy. I'm concerned that we start with a $70,000 project and we end up with 400,000. And so I'm just trying to figure out how we protect the TNRD board from something like that.
So I'm going to change my list and go to CFO Fox because she's waving her hand frantically.
Thank you, Chair Bass. So because the original intention from UBCM with gas tax or community building works funds was to fund core infrastructure, and then they shifted with regional districts to try and allow them to meet their needs of these third parties. The intent of the agreement isn't set up to take on the risk of third party contracts. So we're doing that here at the regional district as something to make sure we're meeting the needs of our directorship and constituents. However, the agreement with UBCM doesn't actually say you can allow for cost overruns. We've kind of taken on the management of the third party, and with the way we have it set up, taking on third party contracts actually puts us at greater risk. If it was, me giving you financial advice from my professional background, I'd say it's probably better to do a lot less of the third party. So trying to follow these parameters and put these rigid pieces in place to make sure that they have contingency up front. So my big spiel here is really, with these groups, we have to do a lot of rigorous upfront work which means we have to really be able to look at their financials and determine if they have the funds to go over. Because a lot of the projects that have put us at risk are projects that are coming back where we are kind of handcuffed. We're handcuffing the directorship by bringing these back and saying, well, you funded this project. Now we're tied to UBC and we're tied to these gas tax requirements. And if we don't meet them, we have to pay it back. So we kind of feel like it's a bit of a forced process, that process. So it doesn't overly answer your question because it's harder to put these demands on third parties because we know that they have very little resources. They often don't have people, they're volunteers that are trying to run these groups. So once we allow them to get into the project, then we're kind of, as Agnes has said, a little bit handcuffed there.
CAO Hildebrand, then Director Stammer, then Director Roden, then Director Thorpe. So you all know, I know you want to speak.
Thank you, Chair. I just had one more addition too, is during that presentation with the EA directors, we had UBCM actually zoom in and talk a little bit about the program. And if you recall, they mentioned that they're also concerned with third party because it's kind of it's not just our regional district. There's many regional districts that do third party and that there's risk associated with. So UBCM is well aware of it. The program ends at the end of 2023 and they're going to start renegotiating with the federal government for the 2024 program. And they may be changing that to actually to eliminate or somehow change third-party agreements. So that's why I think our policy now is kind of skewed to be a bit more stringent in anticipation for a potential change provincially. So.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Yeah, thanks for that clarification, CEO Hillebrand. I find it ironic that our federal government is going to start looking at some additional changes to these types of funding when they can turn around and just basically have a blank check for everything else they do. But my question was, is that section about the third party once every 4 years, is that a federal government requirement or is that a TNRD requirement?
Through the chair, that was something that we put in the development of this policy. And the reason for that is we have some groups that continually come back. So we've become a little bit of a, you know what, just go ask for gas tax. They don't become self-sufficient. It's great when you have a program. If you can provide some seed money to help an organization out, great, but they've got to stand on their own feet after a certain point in time.
Yeah, thanks for the explanation, but isn't that something that the board should be determining and not if somebody else is trying to tell us to do it? And I'll use a point, and if we use an example, let's say a Little Fort Community Hall Society, and they want to do upgrades to the kitchen, and then let's say next year it becomes apparent that there's other opportunities and the area director decides that they would like to make additional improvements. If we go along with this, they won't be able to do that in a 4-year period, will they?
No, they wouldn't. And this policy is presented for you. It is for review. If you have any concerns, I mean, we can certainly go back and take a look at that again. In the case of Little Fort, it's a little bit different in that we do own that facility, but I do understand what you're saying.
The reason I'm suggesting it is because I understand about the third party thing and I get it. You know, it's a little bit harder to keep track, but I'm wondering if there's a possibility that we can make this with an exception that it can be brought to the board for an exception. In other words, if staff believes that we can make an exception to this, everything worked perfectly the last time, the same society, and if they get the board's permission along with the electoral director or whatever's going on for support, that we can do it or not. I'm just suggesting that because maybe there's an opportunity where we can save a whole bunch of money, but it's the last year of the electoral director's what's the word for it? 4-year term, and you know, you could say, well, maybe it's an election play or whatever, but we could also say, well, we can considerably save a lot of money, except that the board's rule is that we can't use that society or that third party until this period of time.
CO Hildebrand.
Thank you, Chair Bass. I think we'd be open to something like that. Like this is a proposal sitting in front of you right now. Of course, our intention with this, or our thought process, was to spread this money wide and far as best we can, in the hopes that some of these third-party societies would actually think a bit broader and not miss maybe that next step and try to include it all at once, potentially. But there's always going to be an exception. And if there's some kind of a mechanism or process that brings it back to the board, that could be something we could undertake or wordsmith in a way that staff could bring it back with all the facts and the board could make a decision, which you could anyway, I guess, technically, but yeah.
Back to my list, I met Director Roden, then Director Middleton.
Thank you very much. Something else that came up at the EA Directors Committee meeting was how to phrase this, putting some sort of fencing around the gas tax community works funds so that projects were not being brought forward and or approved in the run up to an election. That was something that I have noted in the past as something that was done. And I don't think it should be done. Personally, I think it is very off to be telling a community group or making a promise to a community group or suggesting to a community group that, yes, we can get you this funding within literally weeks of going to the polls. So I know that we do have that ring fencing in place, but I believe it's with the regional grants and aid policy, so that there is only one intake in a year where there is a municipal election in the spring. So it's quite far removed. I'm wondering if there is some way that we can introduce some language or some mechanism by which I know September 30th, we say is the deadline for the following year. Obviously, if the elections BC or keeps the municipal elections at October 15th-ish, there's no way that someone can apply by the September 30th deadline and get it approved by the time of the election. But to my mind, the mere act of someone saying to a group, hey, yeah, fill out this form and get your project in front of the TNRD, because we hardly ever turn down any requests. I don't know, just throwing it out there.
Through the chair, you know what, that's a really, really good point. And we had discussed that, and it's good that you brought it up because we actually missed that point. We had some language in there that no projects be approved within 3 months of an election, which I think is similar to the discretionary funding policy. And we'll certainly add that in there. So thank you for bringing that up.
We could forward that to the provincial government.
Director Laird.
One of the funds that I supply quite, I think I've done 2 uptakes, and that's for our local water utility. It's a water society in Lower Nicola. And I think that's something that if you do have extra gas money that a director should be able to, especially go into a utility to keep it functioning and operating. And I don't know if we can put some sort of wording in it that's a utility, a water utility, that the funds can be expended more than once in the 4 years. Is that a possibility, or how do you write that up?
Thank you. Anything's a possibility. My only comment to that would be, how do we prioritize utilities? Because we've got utilities that are drastically under service as well as that we own. So how would we, as long as we have a fair process that makes sense, because if we have, call it 2 water systems that we own that are, absolutely desperate for funding and there's risk associated with them, then we just need a process to figure out how we do that. But I'd be open to something like that, or we could try to look into what that might look like. But that was our thinking behind this, is that we want to look after our own utilities as best we can. But we're open to more discussion.
Director Stamer, did you have your hand up?
Oh, that's fine, thank you.
Manager Campbell, can we actually pass this recommendation when there's been discussion and apparently some parts of it were omitted?
That you'd like to make, right? Potentially.
We've been taking notes. I hope others have been taking notes. So I think the intent would be that we would just take that feedback and incorporate it into a final draft that would go to the board, if that works for the committee.
Okay, so then we don't need to do anything with this recommendation. You'll just fix it and bring it to the board, because we've got the 3-month thing to put in there as well.
Exactly. Yeah, we'll just use the wording. The idea with the 3 month is to align with not having any applications for grant funding prior to the start of the nomination period.
Director Stamer.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. So I'm just reading through this again. So originally it said anything under $5,000 wasn't eligible, but then it says internal TNRD service projects and third-party projects with a value of less than 5,000 are not required to submit a formal written application. Is there a difference? Am I missing something? Or is? Because I thought I read originally that anything under 5,000 wasn't going to be eligible, and then I read this as am I missing something?
I may have missed something. I'm sorry. Are you reading that right in the policy?
Yeah, I'm on page 2 of 3, I believe.
Okay.
It says here about it says internal TNRD projects and third-party projects with a value of less than $5,000 are not required to submit a formal written application, but will still be reviewed by the Director of Finance if they're eligible. But I thought I read somewhere else before that anything under 5,000 wasn't going to be approved. Now, did I misread that?
No, I don't, I see that, but I don't think that was worded correctly. The intent would be, and perhaps CFO Fox can help me out here. My understanding was the intent was that anything over 5,000, under $5,000, we wouldn't entertain under gas tax. So we may need to reword that. And part of the reason is through the gas tax process, we need to go to the board. It needs to be approved. We then need to set up an account in the UBCM reporting, and we have to report on it. So, so that's just on page 60 of 75. Yeah, it says, that just refers to third-party projects.
Right.
So that's for third-party projects. So you're asking if that would also apply to internal applications of less than $5,000. So, I'm gonna turn this over to CFO Fox, I guess.
Thank you. I'm seeing if I'm following, but I don't think we spend gas tax on projects that are even near $5,000. We would never fund projects that were probably. I can't even think of spending one gas tax on less than $100,000 for our own projects. That's part of the UBCM
Yeah. Some of them are.
concerns.
Yeah, I thought I read that it wasn't eligible, then it is eligible, so I just wanted to make sure that there wasn't a discrepancy there.
I think we could explicitly state that projects won't be eligible under 5,000, or just the way it's written probably could be worded a little stronger there.
Director Roden.
Well, it does say, due to application and reporting requirements, third-party projects valued at less than $5,000 will not be considered under this funding. That seems fairly unequivocal. And it's because application and reporting requirements are so onerous that a project under $5,000 simply isn't worthwhile. You're going to be spending more time doing the reporting than it takes to do the project. So it does say it's on, oh, I can't tell, it's on page 2 of 5 of the actual policy, so.
If I may, I think I found what Director Stamer is referring to. It's on page 65 of 75. And that's worded incorrectly where it says internal TNRD service projects and third-party projects with a value of less than 5,000 are not required to submit a formal application, but will still be reviewed by the Director of Finance against eligibility criteria, and that's not correct. That wasn't our intent, so we need to take that out. So our apologies for that.
Director Laird.
I have a question on furnace replacements. Yeah, I know most of the minimum these days is $10,000 to $15,000, but that actually fits in the gas tax criteria. Could we not just put in an amount saying a minimum amount of $10,000? I don't know how you word it, so that if you did have a furnace replacement and they needed $10,000 to complete it, could we not say approve $10,000 or more for gas tax, not less than? Because $5,000 doesn't do that anything anymore.
Thank you, Chair Bass, through to the directors. I would actually prefer that. Increasing the limit makes it better overall, I think, for the TNRD to $10,000.
Director Stamer.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, I totally agree with that because, for example, we just did extensive renovations on the furnace heating units at the community hall in Barrier, and it was about $56,000 for 2 new gas furnaces, the heat pumps and all that stuff. So that just kind of puts it in perspective. So I would go along with 10,000. Yep.
Director Middleton.
I'm going to ask a question and it's not sort of really quite related to this, but it's something that sort of stood out to me in the report. And I don't know if it's a typo or quite what. And just on page 4 of 7, if we just go there, it's the recently approved projects not included in these figures are $700,000 for the McClure Fire Hall upgrades and $1 million for Monty Creek Fire Hall construction. What did we spend $700,000 on McClure Fire Hall on? That seems like a very big number for what was an existing fire hall, and I drive by there all the time. It doesn't look too much different than it used to.
Yeah, I can speak that through the chair. So that's been approved, but the money hasn't been spent yet. The work hasn't been done. So we're actually in the process. We just had the tender closed and award the contract, and construction will be starting on the McClure Hall within about a month's time.
So they're getting a new hall.
So they're getting an expanding hall, renovating the community meeting space, and
So same
additional fire
location,
apparatus.
but just big additions to the
Correct,
existing facility. Okay, thanks.
So, yeah.
Director Laird.
I just have a question on the number of fire halls that we're looking at doing in the $1 million.
Oh, sorry.
$1 million that I see put down for the one fire hall, I don't think that would build the hall now, but that's all that's been approved for it. So if the director has more money to put into it, how do we do that with this policy?
Well, I guess that's kind of 2 questions. I'll answer the first question. So the $1 million allocated to the Monty Creek Hall is not all of the funding. There's also 1.3 million approved in borrowing for that project. And sorry, the second part of the question was.
If you're still short of funding after that, how do you address the way the construction costs go? If you short another $25,000 or $30,000 to complete the job, how do you do that if you've expended all your approved funding?
So I guess
Especially if a director has the funds to add to it.
yeah, so I guess it depends on the service. In some services, there may be additional reserves or taxation that's able to be used, but it would really depend on the specific service. And then the process for going back for gas tax would be. Yeah.
I think the difference there would be, that would be our project. And we could more easily come back to the board and have that discussion. And what we're saying is third party needs to cover those overages. We of course need to follow the same thing, but we have it's a little bit easier to come back and bring that to the board with one of our projects so that we can walk you through the details. So that could be the answer.
Director Roden.
Thank you. Perhaps I'm being dense. Is there a maximum that someone can ask for? No, the number 174,000 is floating in my head as the maximum amount that a single electoral area director can give to any one project in a given time period. But I'm just wondering if we need to have a ceiling if we don't already. And like I said, that 174,000 is just in my head. I think it came up with the Smith Pioneer Park Director Laird. Is that the one that? Yeah, but that's a project that we heard something about a maximum amount that could be given at a certain time.
Through the chair, we've never had a limit on the maximum amount. So perhaps that's something that we should consider putting in here for any one project, especially if it's a third party project, but that would, yeah, we're certainly open to that.
Just a quick question to that. What do you know, Agnes, what the largest project we've done for a third party, roughly?
$402,000. And that was.
And how many makes sense?
Having said that, there is one third party that has received over $800,000. And that's over a number of years.
Any other questions, suggestions? No, so we'll just leave this for you guys to work on and bring back to the board. Okay, CL, you look like you want to speak.
I just wanted to wrap up if I could, just with, I know staff have put a lot of work into this and we appreciate all the feedback because we missed a few things and I'm glad you were able to clarify that. And I think it's a much stronger policy now going back to the board, and hopefully we can have a good discussion at the board as well, because I think we'll be much tighter bringing that one to the board.
Manager Campbell, you know, I keep going to call you Manager Mazzotta. I'm sorry. That's why I'm stumbling.
I learned from the best. So I would just recommend that the committee, and maybe I missed it, at least move this recommendation, like giving direction that an amended policy go to the board. But in terms of what's been proposed here, we won't make any amendments with that. We'll just take all the input and feedback. But just so we at least have a recommendation that we bring forward to the next board meeting, that this committee supports essentially this amended policy, subject to the changes that we're going to make that have been provided here today.
CFO Fox.
Thank you, Chair Bass. I just want to clarify, that what I heard is there is a bit of a desire to be able to address projects within the year and having a miscellaneous amount within the budget, a certain amount, so that we could react to projects within the year on a minimal basis might be the desire of the board. And if that's so, then we'll just bring an amount forward that maybe we think is suitable.
Sure. Does someone want to move what Deanna said?
So moved.
Thank you, Director Smith. Seconded by Director Morris. Any more discussion on this? Director Middleton.
If you don't mind, thank you. So when we talk about some funding set aside, can gas tax be application for on what might be considered to be emergency repairs and replacements? So when we talk about that sort of year out, we've got a community hall whose roof has a sudden fail that they weren't anticipating, and now would they be coming to us and saying, well, you make application, but you're past the deadline and now you're gonna have to wait a year before you're gonna be able to do your repairs? Can those types of repairs be included?
Thank you, Chair Bass. I think that would be a great addition. Just thinking on the fly here with my peers, just to put a statement in there that said there will be some ability in emergent situations for this to come to the board for decision within the year, and have some sort of wording like that in there. And then that leaves it so people kind of are expected to do it a year in advance, but it gives you the ability without going against your own policy.
At the back. Go ahead.
I'm Kim. I'm the grants and research assistant. So just to note on that point is gas tax is not eligible for repairs and maintenance. So one thing to be cautious of, if we have a flood or something like that, that's their insurance. Or if their roof caves in because a tree lands on it, that's their insurance. If their furnace breaks, that's a little bit unexpected, but it is their responsibility to plan for unexpected things, a new roof and things like that. It's not our responsibility to fund something that was, I don't know, maintenance and insurance or something like that. So that's just something that we, we could have an emergency situation, absolutely, but I've also had to say no to 3 different groups this year because they've had floods. And that's a federal rule, not mine, but that's federal.
A community hall association, shall we say, who determines they have a leak in their roof that went previously undiagnosed, and a roofing contractor comes in and says, can't be fixed, got to replace the roof. Now you're into a replacement that was unanticipated, but not by virtue of neglect necessarily on the associations. You're talking volunteer groups and people running their, sometimes stuff happens out there that is just age, wear and tear, and now, or obsolete equipment that can't be repaired anymore, or fixed.
If I may, Kim makes a very, very good point that there are some things that are regular operating maintenance, and it's lack of maintaining that causes these problems. But we have run across situations where, yeah, all of a sudden the roof starts to leak and you take a look at it and you know what, this has been going on for a long time. And the issue that we're dealing with when 30 parties come forward is they have no insurance. So, I mean, if we put in language that says we will review in emergent circumstances, but also keeping in mind that depending on the circumstances, like Kim mentioned, you know what, there were a couple of circumstances, well, you know what, we didn't pay attention to the weather and it got cold and we got flooded out. Those are some of the things that we kind of look at and say, okay, no, you know what, your insurance, this is your responsibility, but there are those situations, as you mentioned, where there are unforeseen circumstances.
Anybody else before I call the question? Any opposed? Carried. We're on to new business, and I believe Manager Campbell would like to review some things with us.
Thank you, Chair Bass. I believe I went over this at the first meeting that sometimes we will bring updates to this committee on administrative policies. So we went over the difference between board policies, which is of the purview and jurisdiction of this committee, but we also have administrative policies that are signed off by the CAO, and they're more operational in nature. And what we also have as part of our previous policy review that we did with the previous policy review committee about a year ago is we identified a number of policies that were board policies, but really properly should have been administrative policies and vice versa. So I just wanted to give you a quick update from the People and Engagement Department in terms of 2 policies that were previously board policies that are now administrative policies. So the first one is an annual holiday office closure. So that's a policy around a closure that we have in the main civic building around the holiday hours. That's very administrative in nature. So that's now an admin policy. The other one was around exempt staff lieu time and exempt staff annual vacation entitlement. There's been some changes to those policies, and those are also now administrative policies because those are very much HR focused. So I just wanted to provide just a quick update to the committee on that.
Any questions? Thank you. I'm going to start with do my part with new business. And I'm going to ask for some input from the CAO and Manager Campbell. I think we should change the mandate of this committee to include reconciliation, to start taking those little steps that we're going to need to take to recognize UNDRIP and reconciliation. So I was hoping we could have some discussion on that, but maybe one of you two can start it off, because I may be completely wrong here. I just see it as some groups got to do it, and because it's going to be governance in the end, it should be here.
Thank you, Chair Bass. I would also agree with your comments. I think it belongs in this committee. I know that we've had this discussion in the recent strategic planning meeting, and the fact that the board is hopefully going to support a resource that's going to help us with the external relationships and really working on reconciliation as part of it. I think that's something that we need to look at and have a forum that we can have those discussions. So I would support it, having it here. Ms. Campbell.
Further to CEO Hildebrand's comments, so the revised mandate of this committee does now include a mandate to consider and make recommendations to the board regarding First Nations engagement strategies and initiatives. So we could also add in reconciliation. Should the committee support that recommendation? And I should just also add that if we're going to add reconciliation, and when we've heard this from a number of neighboring First Nations, that if this committee is going to look at reconciliation, we need to look at reconciliation in partnership with Indigenous communities and First Nation representation at this table. And so it's very early on right now in terms of potential representation on this committee. We would want that interest to come from a First Nation. We would want them to approach us if they want to be a part of this committee or be a part of those discussions. But we do know that there are some First Nation communities that do want to be part of those discussions. So there is interest. I can't say more than that right now, but there is interest there and there's conversations happening. So I would just suggest that if we do add in reconciliation, it also be followed up with the intent that we would want to explore having representation on this committee in order to build reconciliation into that.
Okay, so just to move it forward, I think I'll move that we expand the mandate to include reconciliation, but we also expand the name of the committee to include it as well, so that it's highly visible that that's a priority for this committee. So we have a thank you, seconded by Director Smith. So I'll open it for discussion.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, I agree with the in principle of that. The only question I have is same question I brought up in the past is who is going to be representing those First Nation groups. And again, there's 24 separate groups within our regional district. So I just want to make sure that we're crystal clear on how we're supposed to be able to work this through. I'm all for having inclusion with them as we go forward through this. I'm just trying to figure out how that's going to work.
Just from my point of view, that would be one of the first things that this committee would be doing. Director Morris.
Thank you. And to the who question, I think the most important thing is it isn't us deciding the who and the how. It's that invitation initially in terms of a representative and how having them side by side with us, working through how we approach that because of the number of First Nations that we have within the area. So that would be important. But not us to dictate is what I'm saying, or add a specialized invitation.
Director Middleton, then Director Roden.
I believe, and it may not be that all fall under the same umbrella, but they also have tribal councils that are a combined group, and I'm not too sure how many tribal councils actually exist in our area. Do you know? It's 4. So it might be a case of that each tribal council would want to have a representative, and that gets representation from basically all of their member groups. And so we might have to look at, what size, because we're sort of saying a representative when we're talking, but it might actually be 4 representatives, on the council, as that we cover off, or make sure we have all corners of the district covered.
Director Roden.
Thank you. I believe that this would, regarding who and how, that would be the external relations advisor who would be able to, if we proceed with that position, which we will discuss tomorrow, that person will be a key resource in helping us identify and reach out and follow up, I think. And this is not meant as a slight to anyone in any way, shape, or form, but I know how long it took, how many weeks it took to arrange one single meeting between myself and the Shuswap Nation Tribal Council Chief Roseanne. And she wanted the meeting. I mean, it's not like anyone was trying to hide. It took literally weeks to arrange one meeting. It is very, very easy for someone to lose track of that when they are doing it in addition to a gazillion other things that is part of their job. So an external relations position, I think, will go a very long way to not only ensuring that these overtures are made, but that they are followed up on. And that no one feels that they've been ignored or falling through the cracks.
Anyone else want to talk? No, no, no. no. Call a question. Any opposed? Carried. Any other new business from any of the directors? Then I guess a motion to adjourn would be appropriate. Thank you.